In the spring and early summer of 1943, as the air war over Europe entered its bloodiest phase, the P-47 Thunderbolt arrived in England with a reputation it had not yet earned and a weakness it could not yet overcome. It was big, immensely big for a single-engine fighter, and powerful, armed with 850 caliber machine guns and driven by the massive Pratt& Whitney R2800 engine. But for all its strength, the Thunderbolt suffered from one critical flaw that threatened to break its role in the strategic bombing campaign. It simply could not climb fast enough. Every morning at bases like Debden, Kingscliff, Boxted, and Horsham St. Faith, the runway echoed with the roar of dozens of P-47s taking off in long, staggered lines, their silver fuselages shimmering under English clouds. Pilots in freshly activated units, the 4th Fighter Group, the 56th, the 78th, pulled back on their control sticks and watched the altimeter needles crawl upward with agonizing slowness. They needed altitude. They needed to reach the bomber stream cruising at 20,000 to 25,000 feet. They needed to be in position before the Luftwaffe attacked. But the Thunderbolt's narrow-blade Curtiss and Hamilton Standard propellers struggled to bite into the air during initial climb. The massive radial engine produced extraordinary horsepower, but the blades simply couldn't convert that power into thrust quickly enough. The result was a fighter that took too long, far too long, to get where it needed to be. And time was something the bomber crews did not have. When B-17 and B-24 groups of the 8th Air Force crossed the English coastline and headed toward the Ruhr, Kiel, or Hamburg, they did so alone for the first critical minutes of every mission. It was during these minutes, often just after crossing into hostile territory, that the Luftwaffe struck hardest. Jagdgeschwader pilots in Bf-109Gs and FW-190As dove through the loose perimeter, cannons spitting fire into bombers still forming up, their gunners barely awake, their guns not yet warmed. The P-47s were supposed to protect them, to be the fast-climbing shield that rose with the bombers. Instead, they arrived late. In briefing tents, the tension was palpable. Bomber commanders complained that their formations were being carved apart before escort arrived. Fighter commanders protested that their aircraft physically could not climb any faster. At Fighter Command HQ, the maps told the same story. P-47 squadrons scrambled on time, but their climb to altitude delays created a deadly coverage gap that German pilots exploited with ruthless precision. Reports from April and May 1943 missions testified to the cost. On several raids toward Bremen and Wilhelmshaven, bomber losses spiked during the first 30 minutes of enemy contact, the exact window before the P-47s finally reached altitude. Pilots returning to base found themselves haunted by the sight of burning flying fortresses trailing smoke across the North Sea, victims of an escort fighter still fighting to reach the fight. Some P-47 pilots grew frustrated, even ashamed. They knew the Thunderbolt was nearly unbeatable at high altitude. They knew it could outdive anything in the Luftwaffe. They knew its rugged airframe could take punishing damage and keep flying. But none of that mattered if they arrived too late to help the men who needed them most. The Luftwaffe, keen observers that they were, recognized the weakness almost immediately. German intelligence noted the P-47's sluggish climb and began timing their attacks accordingly. They struck hard, early, and often, well before American fighters could fully form their escort arcs. The sky over northern Europe became a cruel race between the bomber stream and the climbing Thunderbolts, a race the Thunderbolts were losing. At Republic Aviation in New York, engineers received letters and field reports describing the P-47's anemic climb performance. Pratt & Whitney insisted the R-2800's power output was not the issue. Republic agreed. The engine was fine. The fighter was fine. The problem was the propeller. The narrow-blade props installed on early P-47C and initial P-47D models were adequate for cruising and high-speed combat, but they failed to capture the immense torque produced at lower airspeeds during the initial climb. The engine was delivering more power than the blades could transfer to the air. In engineering terms, the Thunderbolt was being throttled by its own propeller. In combat terms, bomber crews were dying because of a mechanical mismatch. By June 1943, the frustration had reached its peak. The 56th Fighter Group, home to some of the most aggressive and technically savvy pilots in the 8th Air Force, sent a clear message up the chain. Fix the climb, or the Thunderbolt will never be a true escort fighter. And as the summer wore on, that warning grew sharper. The strategic bombing campaign was intensifying. The targets were farther away. The Luftwaffe was more coordinated, and bomber losses were rising. If the P-47 could not reach altitude faster, the 8th Air Force risked losing the air war before it had truly begun. Something had to change, something fundamental. And in the middle of 1943, engineers at Hamilton Standard and Republic proposed a modification that seemed almost too simple to matter. An entirely new propeller blade, wider, longer, and dramatically more efficient at converting raw horsepower into thrust. A blade that would let the Thunderbolt climb like the fighter it was always meant to be. A blade that would alter the course of the air war in Europe. But no one yet knew that. In the summer of 1943, all they knew was that the P-47 Thunderbolt, mighty as it was, had a weakness that threatened everything. And the war would soon turn on whether that weakness could be erased.
The solution did not arrive with fanfare or sweeping strategic directives. It arrived quietly, in crates. Long wooden crates marked Hamilton Standard Propeller Assembly began appearing at depots in the United States in mid-1943, then at repair shops and fighter bases across England a few weeks later. Nobody on the flight line knew they contained the modification that would reinvent the Thunderbolt. At first glance, the new blades didn't even look dramatic. They were simply bigger, thicker at the root, broader at the tips, with a scooping curve that resembled the paddle of a canoe more than the slender, elegant blades pilots were used to. But for engineers, the difference was revolutionary. The R2800 double wasp engine churned out over 2,000 horsepower at takeoff, an enormous amount of force for a single-engine fighter. The old narrow blade props simply couldn't grab enough air to convert that horsepower into thrust. It was like trying to row a boat with toothpicks. The new blades, Hamilton Standard 13-foot paddle blades, fitted first to the late P-47C5 and early P-47D models, could finally capture the full torque of the engine. Suddenly, the Thunderbolt had the propeller it had always needed. But before the pilots learned that truth, the ground crews discovered it. At RAF Boxted, home of the 56th Fighter Group, the first test installation happened on a quiet morning in late June 1943. Crew chiefs gathered around as mechanics hoisted the massive blades into place. The numbers looked absurd. The new prop spanned so wide it barely cleared the ground during taxi. When they bolted it in and spun it manually for the first time, the crew chief muttered, "Hell, this thing looks like it belongs on a bomber." And that was the moment they realized exactly why it was needed. The P-47 was large enough to be a bomber engine with wings. It had always demanded a blade this big. The narrow props had been a compromise, one that combat experience had revealed to be unacceptable. The first pilots to test the new propeller were veterans, men who knew every quirk of the Thunderbolt. Captain Walker "Bud" Maheron was among the first group to climb into a modified P-47C. When he opened the throttle, the reaction was immediate. The aircraft lurched forward with a punch he had not felt before, as if someone had grabbed the tail and hurled the fighter down the runway. The takeoff roll shrank by a third. The acceleration pushed him back into his seat. But the real revelation came seconds later. Maheron eased back on the stick, watching the altimeter. The needle didn't crawl anymore, it leapt. The Thunderbolt surged upward, climbing with a force that made his stomach drop. By the time he passed 10,000 feet, he realized the truth. The aircraft was climbing almost 700 feet per minute faster than before. When he landed, he didn't bother with a technical explanation. He just pulled off his oxygen mask, grinning like a man who had just met an airplane. He said, "She climbs like a homesick angel." Word spread instantly. Other groups, the 4th at Debden, the 78th at Goxhill, lined up their aircraft for the modification. What began as a factory fix quickly turned into a field conversion program, with depot mechanics replacing thousands of blades right on the flight line. Some installations happened in the open, with engines still warm from returning sorties. The men working the wrenches did so under pressure. The 8th Air Force needed results immediately. Bomber losses in summer 1943 were rising. Missions to Kiel, Hamburg, Oschersleben, and the Ruhr were costing crews at a rate no high command could sustain. Fighter Command knew the Thunderbolt could help, but only if it could reach altitude in time. So, the paddle blade installations became a race against the Luftwaffe. Engines were shut down, props unbolted, new assemblies hoisted up, and jets tested, all in less than an hour. The smell of grease, fuel, and hot metal hung over the bases day and night. Pilots watched anxiously as mechanics tightened bolts and torqued fittings. They knew their next mission might be the difference between saving bombers or arriving in time to watch them fall. For the pilots who got the upgraded aircraft, the effect was transformative. Takeoff became smoother, more confident. The moment they opened the throttle, the Thunderbolt surged forward like a kicked stallion. No more wallowing, no more sluggishness, no more praying that the altimeter would move faster. Now they gained height rapidly enough to form up with bombers before the B-17s reached the coast. During practice scrambles, pilots found that their modified P-47s could outclimb not only their older Thunderbolt peers, but sometimes even Spitfire Mk9s at low altitude, a fact that stunned everyone on the ground. Reports from flight test officers were unequivocal. Climb rate increased from approximately 2,300 feet per minute to nearly 3,000 feet per minute. The numbers were real, the pilots' enthusiasm was real, and soon the Luftwaffe would discover that the change was real, terrifyingly real. As the summer of 1943 burned toward autumn, the stage was set for the first missions where paddle blade Thunderbolts would rise with the bombers, reach altitude in time, and finally give the Flying Fortresses the escort they had been promised since the day the P-47 arrived in England. The fighter that had been too slow was about to become the fighter the Germans feared. And everything began with a field modification in wooden crates.
The first time the Luftwaffe realized something had changed, it was already too late. It happened over the North Sea on a cold, sharp morning in September 1943. The kind of day where the bomber stream looked like a silver highway stretching all the way from England to Bremen. B-17s of the 1st Bomb Division droned eastward, engines steady, contrails forming long white scars across the sky. And beside them, exactly beside them, not struggling thousands of feet below, flew P-47 Thunderbolts that had climbed into escort position faster than the German radar operators expected. They were the newly modified birds, the ones with paddle blade propellers, and they flew like different machines entirely. Only weeks earlier, these fighters would still have been clawing their way to 20,000 feet when the Luftwaffe pounced. Narrow blade propellers had forced the Thunderbolt into a long, lumbering climb that punished pilots and cost the bombers precious minutes of protection. But now, the transformation was astonishing. The moment the upgraded Thunderbolts opened their throttles, the 13-foot Hamilton Standard blades bit into the air with a power the old props had never managed. Instead of struggling upward at around 2,300 feet per minute, the P-47s now surged skyward at nearly 3,000 feet per minute, closing the altitude gap before the B-17s even reached the Dutch coastline. It wasn't subtle. Pilots felt it in their guts. The Thunderbolt no longer eased into the climb. It lunged, pinning them to their seats with a force they described as unexpected, violent, glorious. And that climb made something possible that had rarely happened before. The P-47s were waiting at altitude when the bombers arrived. The Germans noticed immediately. Luftwaffe ground controllers overwatching the bomber stream that morning radioed warnings to the fighters of Jagdgeschwader 26. American escort at height. Thunderbolts at height. That message had not been heard in months. One German pilot later recalled his shock. The big American fighters were already there. They were not climbing behind the bombers, they were with them. The technical shift that made this moment possible was almost invisible, just a new propeller blade. But in combat, it felt like an earthquake. The P-47 could now launch, form up, and climb into the protective arc with confidence. Escort formations were tighter, earlier, stronger. And that meant that when Bf-109Gs and FW-190As dove toward the bomber stream, they no longer found a gap. They found a wall. One Thunderbolt pilot from the 56th Fighter Group described the feeling in his combat report. Before the new props, we chased the fight. After them, we owned the fight. A typical mission demonstrated the difference with brutal clarity. On September 15th, the 56th FG scrambled from RAF Horsham St. Faith to rendezvous with a bomber stream headed for Emden. Under the old configuration, they would have been climbing for nearly 20 minutes before reaching escort altitude. With paddle blades, they made it in roughly 12. That 8-minute difference was the margin between presence and absence, between deterrence and disaster. As they approached the Dutch coast, radar operators warned of incoming FW-190s forming for an attack run. But when the Germans broke through the scattered clouds, they didn't find defenseless bombers. They found Thunderbolts already at altitude, fanned out in a loose weave that covered the bomber boxes with a lethal umbrella of 50 caliber fire. The first clash confirmed every promise the engineers had made. A flight of FW-190s dove on the high squadron of B-17s expecting the Thunderbolts to be lower and out of position. Instead, a pair of paddleblade P-37Ds intercepted from above, something that had rarely been possible before the modification. The Thunderbolts met the Germans head-on, forcing them to break early and ruining the attack geometry. One of the German fighters tried to climb out of danger, but the P-47 now had the thrust it needed to chase upward aggressively. A short burst of 50 caliber fire hammered into the FW-190 starboard wing, sending it spiraling out of formation. Another Thunderbolt rolled hard left and dove on the second attacker, driving him off before he could line up a shot. This was not the P-47 of April or May 1943. This was a Predator. Bomber crews felt the difference as deeply as the pilots. Radio men and waist gunners who had grown used to watching Thunderbolts struggle upward beneath them now looked out their windows to see escorts already in position, flying level with the formation, guarding them like armored knights. One B-17 gunner from the 306th Bomb Group wrote in his diary, "The Jugs were there today, early. First time I ever saw them form up before we hit the coast." For the first time since the daylight bombing campaign began, the escorts felt predictable, reliable, present. The coverage gap, the dead window when the Luftwaffe had the advantage, was closing. And the enemy felt it too. German fighter groups that had timed their attacks to coincide with the Thunderbolts' late arrival suddenly found themselves pressed, tangled, and harassed earlier than ever before. They had relied on altitude, speed, and timing to hit the bombers at their weakest, but now the P-47s denied them that timing, matching climbs they had once easily outrun. The change didn't win the air war overnight. The P-47 still lacked the range to escort bombers all the way to the deepest targets, not until late 1943 and early 1944, when drop tanks extended their legs. But the paddleblade modification fixed the aircraft's greatest flaw at the exact moment the 8th Air Force needed it most. And as the bomber offensive intensified toward the autumn of 1943, one truth was becoming unmistakable. The Thunderbolt was no longer catching up to the war. It was finally shaping it.
By the autumn of 1943, the change was unmistakable. Where once the P-47 Thunderbolt had been a late-arriving guardian struggling to climb into the fight, it was now a constant presence, rising swiftly with the bomber stream, forming a shimmering silver shield at 25,000 feet and meeting the Luftwaffe head-on before a single cannon round could find a B-17's aluminum skin. The Hamilton Standard paddle blade propeller had not merely improved the Thunderbolt's climb rate, it had reshaped the very geometry of the air war. Suddenly, the 8th Air Force could plan missions with the expectation, not the hope, that Thunderbolts would be in position. And that small shift rippled outward into something far larger, the first real Allied ability to press daylight bombing deeper into Germany with confidence. The transformation became clear during the missions of September and October 1943. As B-17s and B-24s rose from airfields across East Anglia in the early morning haze, the upgraded P-47Ds now climbed with a smooth, assertive thrust that erased the old anxiety of lagging behind. The bomber crews noticed it first. Waist gunners peering through frost-rimmed windows saw Thunderbolts sliding into escort positions far earlier in the climb. Pilots of the lead elements of the 1st and 3rd Bomb Divisions reported seeing P-47 top cover as early as the English coastline, a sight virtually unheard of only months before. And the Luftwaffe felt the difference almost immediately. Their intercept patterns, honed after months of exploiting the Thunderbolt's slow ascent, began to falter. German controllers who once timed their attacks to strike bombers before escort arrived now found Thunderbolts waiting like sentinels over the North Sea.
In late September, during a series of raids toward Emden and Oldenburg, German pilots from JG-26 and JG-2 broke out of cloud layers expecting undefended bomber formations, and instead met P-47s diving straight at them from above. One pilot later wrote in frustration that the Americans had become impossible to predict, their fighters appearing earlier, higher, and in greater strength. That was the difference a 700-foot-per-minute climb improvement made. The Thunderbolt was now a machine that controlled altitude instead of chasing it, and altitude was life. The change empowered the 8th Air Force to begin a new phase of the bombing campaign: deeper targets, longer penetrations, and a willingness to fight their way into the German heartland instead of merely skimming its edges. As October 1943 unfolded, paddle-blade P-47s escorted bombers into airspace that had been too dangerous only weeks earlier. Bremen, once a graveyard of B-17s, now saw escorts overhead for more of the mission. Hanover, Münster, Wilhelmshaven, and the industrial zones ringing the Ruhr felt the pressure of improved American fighter performance, and the Luftwaffe responded with fury. On October 14, 1943, the 8th Air Force launched the second Schweinfurt raid, a mission that would become infamous for bomber losses, but equally revealing for the evolving role of the P-47. Though the Thunderbolts still lacked the range to stay with the bomber stream all the way to the target, their paddle blade-enhanced climb allowed them to provide a longer, stronger escort during the opening and closing phases of the mission. On earlier raids, the Luftwaffe had feasted on bombers during these windows. Now they had to fight past swarms of Thunderbolts whose improved climb and acceleration allowed them to intercept German formations earlier, disrupt their runs, and blunt the precise timing that German units depended on. One P-47 pilot from the 4th Fighter Group recalled diving on a formation of Bf-109 G6s that had expected to find the bomber stream unguarded. They weren't looking for us yet. The climb got us there early. It let us hit them before they could get into their attack pattern. This was the essence of the change. The Thunderbolt was no longer reacting to the Luftwaffe. It was preempting it. The improved climb also transformed the way P-47 groups fought. Previously, many P-47 pilots avoided vertical engagements with the more agile Messerschmitts and Focke-Wulfs until they had enough altitude to dive with advantage. Now they could take the fight upward with confidence. The paddle blades gave them the ability to match German climb bursts long enough to spoil an enemy's attempt to zoom away. German pilots accustomed to out-climbing Thunderbolts suddenly found themselves pursued aggressively in the vertical, with the big American fighter hanging on their tails longer than physics should have allowed. The enemy noticed. From late 1943 intelligence summaries, Luftwaffe staff wrote that the Thunderbolt has improved its climbability and can now press attacks in vertical maneuver. That was an extraordinary admission from a force that had long relied on superior climb to dictate engagements. And yet, perhaps the most important effect of the modification was psychological. For the bomber crews watching from their turrets, the early appearance of the Thunderbolts meant hope. It meant they were no longer alone during the most vulnerable stretch of their missions. It meant the escorts could meet the Luftwaffe with strength rather than desperation. For the fighter pilots, it meant pride, a sense that their Thunderbolt was now what it had been promised to be, a high-altitude guardian worthy of the men who flew it. Reports from the 56th, 4th, and 78th Fighter Groups were filled with the same sentiment. With paddle blades, the P-47 had finally come into its own. And for the Luftwaffe, it meant trouble. Their defensive rhythm they had used for a year was broken. Their intercept timelines were disrupted. Their pilots were forced into harder, riskier angles of attack. And all of it came from a modification so small it could be shipped in a wooden crate. The P-47 still lacked the range to follow the bombers to the deepest German targets. That challenge would not be solved until drop tanks and the arrival of the P-51 Mustang changed the game. But in late 1943, during the most desperate phase of the daylight bombing campaign, the paddle blade propeller turned the Thunderbolt from a struggling escort to an aerial bulwark that could finally hold the line. The war in the air was shifting, and soon the Germans would feel the full weight of what the improved Thunderbolt could do.
By the time winter crept over East Anglia in late 1943, the pilots of the 8th Air Force no longer spoke about the paddle blade propeller as a modification. They spoke about it as a rebirth. The Thunderbolt that had arrived in England in the spring, a lumbering brute with magnificent diving power but a frustrating mission-breaking climb, was gone. In its place stood the fighter the designers had always intended, a machine that could rise fast, hit hard, and meet the Luftwaffe on equal terms at the altitudes where the air war would be decided. Yet the true impact of the modification only became clear when commanders reviewed the after-action reports of the autumn bombing campaign. Mission logs from September to December 1943 showed a dramatic improvement in escort effectiveness. Radar plots revealed that P-47 units were reaching escort altitude earlier and holding it longer. The coverage gap that had once stretched tens of miles into enemy territory had shrunk to almost nothing. And bomber crews who had grown used to watching Thunderbolts struggle beneath them began reporting that the fighters were visible beside or above the bomber stream from the earliest phases of the mission. Bombardier diaries spoke of hearing P-47 engines overhead while still forming at 18,000 feet. Waist gunners wrote that the sight of Thunderbolts sliding into station as the bombers turned toward the German coast felt like a promise kept. On the other side of the channel, the Luftwaffe's reaction was equally telling. Jagdgeschwader commanders noted that American escort fighters were appearing earlier than anticipated, disrupting attack patterns before German fighters could properly mass. Pilots who once used vertical maneuvers to shake Thunderbolts now found themselves pursued through climbs they had expected to dominate. Technical officers reported that the P-47's enhanced climbability had forced them to adjust interception windows, altering long-established timings that had given the Luftwaffe its early raid successes throughout 1942 and early 1943. What German pilots did not know was that the transformation had come from a simple mechanical change, not a new model. The P-47 they now faced was the same brute they had fought months before. Same weight, same engine, same 8 guns, except now it had the propeller it had always needed. And that single change allowed the 8th Air Force to attempt missions that would have been suicidal only weeks earlier. When bomber formations struck Bremen, Emden, and Münster in late 1943, the Thunderbolt's improved climb allowed escort to intercept attacking fighters earlier, preventing the kind of coordinated mass German assaults that had devastated unprotected bomber streams during the first Schweinfurt raid in August. Even though the P-47 still lacked the range to escort bombers to their deepest targets, its ability to control the early and mid stages of the mission reduced bomber attrition and bought the 8th Air Force time to refine tactics, time to expand its fighter force, time to introduce longer-range drop tanks, and eventually, time to integrate the P-51 Mustang into the deepest escort roles. Without the paddle blade modification, that time might never have existed. Logistics officers at Republic Aviation later calculated that the improved climb rate, rising from roughly 2,300 feet per minute to nearly 3,000 feet per minute, cut the average time required for a P-47 group to reach 25,000 feet by nearly a third. In combat terms, those minutes often meant the difference between meeting the bombers at altitude or watching them take their first losses alone. Fighter group commanders recognized the change instantly. Colonel Hubert Zemke of the 56th reported that his squadrons could now deploy at altitude on schedule, something that had been rare before the upgrade. Republic test pilot Herb Fisher later stated, "The Thunderbolt was always a high-altitude fighter, waiting for the right propeller." And the numbers supported him. In late 1943, the 56th, 4th, and 78th Fighter Groups saw rising kill ratios against the Luftwaffe, matching or surpassing their best performances of the year. The P-47's legendary ability to dive and roll had never been questioned. Now it had the climb to complete the triangle. Just as important was what the modification meant for strategy. Before mid-1943, the daylight bombing campaign was in crisis. High losses threatened the viability of the doctrine itself. The fragile balance between bomber endurance and escort availability seemed doomed to fail. But once the Thunderbolt gained the climb rate required to meet the bombers early and reliably, the 8th Air Force gained the breathing room it desperately needed. That breathing room allowed the Allies to maintain pressure on German industry through late 1943, even as they prepared for the decisive shift toward full-range escort in early 1944. When historians later dissected the campaign, they found that the paddle blade propeller stood alongside drop tanks and radar-guided interception changes as one of the subtle engineering shifts that quietly changed the war's trajectory. It kept the Thunderbolt relevant at a moment when the bombing offensive might have collapsed. It blunted the Luftwaffe's most effective interception tactics. It gave bomber crews hope and protection when they needed it most. And it allowed the 8th Air Force to hold the line while newer, longer-legged escorts were brought into the fight. The modification was so deceptively simple that most bomber crews never realized how close they had come to disaster before it came. To them, the Thunderbolt had simply finally arrived. And in a way, that was true. The aircraft that Republic had built, massive, rugged, unstoppable in a dive, had always needed altitude to unleash its strengths. The paddle blade propeller gave it that altitude, and with it a new identity. No longer the lumbering climber of early 1943, the Thunderbolt became an aerial sentinel, a guardian, a fighter that could meet the Luftwaffe on its own terms. And for the men flying into Germany in cold aluminum bombers, that meant everything. Beneath the roar of 850 caliber guns, beneath the thunder of the R-2800, the sound that changed the air war was quiet. The steady, powerful bite of paddle blade propellers pulling the P-47 into the sky faster than ever before. A small change, a wooden crate delivered to muddy airfields, a handful of new blades bolted to old hubs, and an entire air campaign transformed.